My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm founder of the Parent Education Series and co-founder of the nonprofit, The Parent Venture. We could not be more delighted to have with us today Dr. Anna Lemke from the Stanford University School of Medicine. She has been generous to this program in the past, but we could not be more delighted. With more than 430 of you registered today, we know that this is a really timely topic. If you would like Spanish interpretation, we have with us today Cynthia Hinestrosa, who will be offering Spanish. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a globe icon. If you click on the globe and then Spanish, you will hear interpretation in Spanish. All right, well, again, a very timely topic. Special thanks to today's presenter and our sponsors, the Sequoia Union High School District, the Sequoia Healthcare District, Peninsula Healthcare District, and nonprofit The Parent Venture. We would not be here without your support. Today, we're going to have 30 to 40 minutes of content with Dr. Lemke, followed by questions from you, the audience. So what we'd like you to do is use the chat button to talk to one another, to talk to us. My partner, Bev Hartman, will also be sharing relevant links for today's conversation, including links to Dr. Lemke's books. And then we ask that you put questions in the Q&A button. If you can, keep those kind of brief and as general as possible. We really want to get to as many of your questions today as we can. A little bit later in the talk, you will see a link to a survey in the chat. We really hope you will take 2 minutes to fill out that survey. It helps us both for future planning and for grant funding with our sponsors. We promise we read everyone, so please do feel free to make comments. Also, today's event will be recorded and available on our video library. So if you have somebody, a spouse, a partner, a child that you would like to share it with, it will be available on our free YouTube channel. Our next event coming up on Friday, March 26th, this Friday, also at 12 noon, is with Dr. Dave Anderson from Child Mind Institute in New York. This is also a timely event as schools reopen, called Put the Oxygen Mask on Yourself, Parent Stress Management Strategies. So we hope that you will join us on Friday. All right, let me tell you a little bit about today's keynote speaker. Dr. Anna Lemke is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University School of Medicine. She is medical director of Stanford Addiction Medicine, program director for the Stanford Addiction Medicine Fellowship, and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. Dr. Lemke was one of the first in the medical community to sound the alarm regarding opioid overprescribing and the opioid epidemic. In 2006, she published her best-selling book on the prescription drug epidemic, Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop. She recently appeared on the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, that I know that many of you saw, an unvarnished look at the impact of social media on our lives. Her forthcoming book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, explores the problem of compulsive overconsumption, including digital products, and how to achieve the good life in a dopamine-overloaded world. Please join me in a really warm welcome for Dr. Anna Lemke. Take it away, Anna.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here today, and thank you to all of you who have taken the time to come listen. What I'd like to do is tell you about a very typical type of case that I see nowadays, and this patient has given me permission to share his story with you anonymously. So this was a young man, about 19 years old, who came to see me about 1.5 years ago. And when I said to him, what do you think is going on? His answer to me was, well, I'm a sunk cost fallacy. I said, I don't know what that is. Can you explain that to me? He said, yeah, sunk cost fallacy is when you keep putting money and effort into a failed endeavor. I said, okay, well, in what ways are you a sunk cost fallacy? He said, well, I come from a really good family. My parents are really nice people. We have lots of privilege. I went to private schools. I had all the best tutors. I had everything that really a young person could want. And yet I've failed everybody. I haven't made anything of my life. I thought to myself, wow, that's really sad that he feels that way about himself. Then I said, well, why don't you tell me a little bit more about what happened? He said, okay, well, I always loved video games. And I played a lot of video games in high school. But basically it was manageable. My parents, kind of monitored it and kept me in check. But when I went away to college, I found myself feeling really anxious about meeting new people, about starting in classes. And so I was playing video games, to just sort of relax and unwind like I normally would, except that I found myself retreating more and more into playing video games, playing later and later into the night. And eventually it got to the point where after about 2 or 3 months, I was really behind in my classes. And the more behind I got in my classes, the more I played video games. And the more I played video games, the more behind I got. And eventually I just got so depressed and so anxious and so overwhelmed, failing out of my classes, not meeting anybody, not enjoying any of my classes, that I just decided maybe I'd be better off dead. So he started to make plans to end his life somehow or another. Somebody in his dorm or among his tenuous new friendship group found out about it. His parents were called. He admitted that he was very depressed and very anxious. They came out to his college campus, brought him home again, and brought him to see me. And I said to him, well, what do you think is the relationship between your wanting to, feeling like maybe you want to die, feeling that, life's not worth living, feeling depressed and anxious, and the video game playing? And he said, oh, well, that's very clear to me. Video games are really the only thing that give me any relief from my suffering. They're the only thing that sort of ease my anxiety and ease my depression. They're the only thing I'm really interested in, honestly. I don't really enjoy anything else. I thought I was going to be a computer science major and all of my classes were really boring. I thought I'd meet a bunch of, cool new people, and I didn't meet anybody. I just would play video games online with my friends from high school, or frankly, with anybody, any stranger around the world who was willing to play. So he said, I really see the video games as, kind of the only respite for my purposeless and joyless kind of existence. So I said to him, okay, I hear you. I hear you that the video games give you joy and that they're the only thing that's interesting to you. They're your escape and they're your relief. But I said, I have a hypothesis. And my hypothesis is that it actually may be the video games that caused you to become depressed and anxious in the first place, and to get to a point where you were thinking about ending your life. He said, oh, Dr. Lemke, that's not right. I don't think that couldn't be. I mean, how would that work? And I said, well, okay, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the neuroscience of pleasure and pain, so that I might be able to convince you on the possibility that my hypothesis is true. And so I did. And that's what I'm going to explain to you now, a kind of condensed version of the last 50 years of neuroscience of pleasure and pain. So the first very significant finding is the discovery of the neurotransmitter dopamine. Now, first of all, what is a neurotransmitter? A neurotransmitter is a chemical in the brain that links to synapses or to neurons, So we have our presynaptic neuron, right? And that sends a signal through an electrical impulse to the postsynaptic neuron, which receives it and sends that electrical signal on. But those neurons don't actually touch each other. There's a little gap between them that's called the synapse. And that synapse is bridged by small chemicals that are called neurotransmitters. And dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter in the experience of pleasure. It's not the only neurotransmitter, but it's probably the most important one. And it is the one that neuroscientists have come to use as a kind of general currency for how pleasurable something is, or for that matter, how addictive it is. The second very interesting and important finding in neuroscience that relates to the science of addiction is the discovery that the same part of the brain that processes pleasure also processes pain, and that pain and pleasure work like a balance. So I want you to imagine that in your brain, in the area called the reward pathway, there is a beam on a center fulcrum, kind of like a teeter-totter in a playground. And when that teeter-totter is in its resting position. The beam is level with the ground. It's neither tilted to one side or another. So a little bit different from a teeter-totter, because teeter-totters are usually resting on the ground. Okay, now when we experience pleasure, our balance tips one way, and when we experience pain, our balance tips in the other direction, okay? And that this is an evolutionarily very fine-tuned apparatus in our brain, conserved over millennia and across species in order to keep us alive, right? We have to know what is pleasurable to be able to approach those things, to be able to get the basic goods of survival, food, clothing, shelter, finding a mate. We also have to know what's painful in order to be able to retreat from that painful stimulus. But here's the fundamental problem. We are now living not in a land of scarcity, but in a land of almost grotesque overabundance. And so one of our primary tasks in the modern age has become to avoid highly pleasurable substances and behaviors because they're everywhere and they're incredibly potent and they come in infinite variety, so that whatever your drug of choice is may not be mine, but I'll eventually find mine because there are so many different options out there. Okay, so let's talk about what happens in the brain when we do something pleasurable. For me, I really like chocolate. So when I eat a piece of chocolate, my pleasure-pain balance tips slightly to the side of pleasure. When that happens, I get a little release of dopamine in that part of the brain that we've called the reward pathway. But there are certain fundamental rules that are governing this pleasure-pain balance that become essential to the way that we experience the world. And the first rule governing this balance is that the balance wants to stay level. And a level balance is called homeostasis. So our brains will work very hard to preserve this homeostasis. That means that right after I eat a piece of chocolate and I get a little release of chocolate-related dopamine, my brain is going to downregulate my own production of dopamine and my own production of dopamine receptors on that postsynaptic neuron in order to bring my balance level again. One of the ways that I imagine that is to imagine these little gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. The gremlins represent neuroadaptation or downregulation of my own dopamine and my own dopamine receptors. But the thing about the gremlins is that they really like it on the balance. So they don't get off as soon as my balance is level. They stay on until my balance has tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that is called the opponent process reaction. And I experience that as that moment of wanting a second piece of chocolate. It's very subtle, might even be just outside my conscious awareness, but it's right there and it's got me reaching for another piece. If I wait a few moments, the gremlins hop off and my balance is level again. I've reasserted homeostasis. And that's a good thing. I need a level balance in order to optimize my survival, right? Because a level balance is a sensitive balance and it can respond to changes in my environment, new pleasures that come my way that I need to go and get, or painful stimuli that put me in danger that I need to avoid. I need a resilient, sensitive, plastic, meaning changeable balance to respond to changes in my environment. Okay, now let's talk about what happens in the brain as people become addicted. First of all, the fundamental difference between substances or behaviors that are addictive and those that are not is how much dopamine they release in my reward pathway. Things that are addictive release a lot of dopamine and do it very quickly, like video games. So when I am playing a video game, I don't just get a little tip to the side of pleasure. I get a great big tip, right? And that's because video games are my drug of choice. They're just that elemental thing that just tips my balance. So now that little chocolate gremlin, that's not enough to reassert a level balance. I need a great big Arnold Schwarzenegger gremlin on my pain side, bringing it level again. But remember, the gremlins like it on the balance, so they tip me hard to the side of pain, and that's that come down. That's that feeling I get right when I get off the video game. That feeling of, oh, that's painful. I wish I could keep playing. If I wait long enough, the gremlin hops off and I've reasserted homeostasis. Now let's talk about what happens to the balance with repeated exposure to the same or similar addictive stimulus. With repeated exposure, the response to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, and the opponent process response gets stronger and longer, which is why with repeated use of an addictive substance or behavior, I need more and more over time to get the same effect. And when I'm not using, I'm essentially dealing with a balance tilted toward the side of pain, or a dopamine deficit state. And this is what happens in the process of becoming addicted to any substance or behavior. We reset our threshold for experiencing pleasure, needing more and more of the stimulus to feel pleasure, and we become more vulnerable to the experience of pain because we end up with a balance that's chronically tilted to the side of pain, because those gremlins, they like it on the balance, right? And I'm ingesting so much dopamine in the form of this drug that my brain is working very hard to downregulate dopamine and dopamine receptors, so that now when I'm not using, I've got a balance that's tilted to the side of pain, right? That's the come down or withdrawal, but it persists, not just for hours, but for days to weeks to months. So that I'm using now just to feel normal. Plus, if I eat a piece of chocolate, or I go to class, or I meet up with friends for dinner, it's not very much fun, because that's not strong enough to tilt my balance to the side of pleasure once I have the gremlins of homeostasis weighing my balance down on the side of pain. So in a truncated version, I explained this to my patient, and I said, I think what happened is that you were bombarding your reward pathway with so much dopamine and engaging in video games that you essentially put yourself into a dopamine deficit state, such that there was nothing else you enjoyed. And when you weren't playing video games, you were increasingly depressed and anxious. And so I would like to suggest that we do an experiment. And that experiment is, I would like you to abstain from all screens and devices for 1 month. Why 1 month? Because in my experience, once people have become addicted to a substance or behavior and reset their homeostatic set point to the side of pain, it takes a month for those gremlins to hop off and for neutrality or homeostasis to be restored. And I want to warn you, if you agree to do this experiment, that in the first 2 weeks, you'll feel worse before you'll feel better. Why is that? Because the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance are irritability, insomnia, anxiety, dysphoria, and craving for the drug in the form of intrusive thoughts and images. So essentially, when you're not playing video games, you're going to have a balance weighted to the side of pain, and it's going to take a while for those gremlins to hop off. And you probably will feel really bad in those first 2 weeks, but if you just wait it out, eventually you will restore homeostasis. And he said to me, Dr. Lemke, I don't think that that's going to work, but I've tried everything else, and so I'm willing to try that. So I give him a lot of credit. He was willing to try that. And let me just say, 20 years ago, I would not have done that, even if the drug had been alcohol or cannabis. If I had a patient coming into me and they were complaining of anxiety and depression, I would have prescribed an anxiolytic. I would have prescribed an antidepressant. I would have recommended some form of psychotherapy. My practice has radically changed in the last 20 years because I now recognize what this chronic congestion of high dopamine goods is doing to our brains. So this courageous young man was at home living with his parents. He wasn't in school. He had taken time off, and he agreed to get rid of all of his consoles and screens, his phone, really big deal. He and I both agreed that if he was on his phone at all, he would be watching YouTube videos of people playing video games, which would make him want to play video games. So we agreed absolutely no screens. And he went home, and his parents were on board with this plan. And he came back a month later, And he said, Dr. Lemke, you are not going to believe this. I said, what? What is it? He said, I am actually less depressed than I have felt in almost a year. And I said, that is awesome. Tell me what happened. He said, well, I did what you said. I put all the screens away. I was incredibly bored. I said, tell me about being bored. What did you do at that time? He said, well, I kind of like went out and looked for other people in the house. Like I went out and hung out with my mom in the kitchen and we had some conversations. And I took my dog out for a walk and I played Frisbee and I read books. I haven't read books in a long time. I said, how was that for you? He said, like I said, at first it was really boring. And I just kept thinking about how boring it was and how much I wanted to play video games or be online, how much I missed my friends because all my friends are online. He said, but after about 2 weeks, I really noticed I started sleeping better. My appetite was better. I had more energy. I was just less anxious and depressed. It wasn't like, a revolutionary thing, but I just started to feel better. And I can honestly say now that I feel better than I have in a really long time. So of course, very joyful. This happens with so many patients of mine. I'm absolutely a believer in the impact of these high dopamine substances and behaviors on kids' brains. And I really, really believe in this dopamine fast, not just for my patients, but for myself as well, for my family members, for my children. Then I said to him, as I always do, well, now that you've done it and you're feeling better, what would you like to do going forward? Would you like to continue to abstain, or do you want to go back to using video games? He said, well, I really realize now how addicted to video games I was, and I think I want to abstain for another month. And that's really awesome, and I encouraged him in that, and he abstained for another month. He felt better and better and better. He abstained for a month after that. He was super motivated because he had been really, really down. Then he came back and said, I'm really starting to miss my friends. I want to go back to using video games, but I want to use them differently than I used them before. I said, okay, how differently? He said, I want to use them in more moderation. I want it to be not something that's taken over my brain and my life, but something that I have control of. So then we talked about barriers that he could put in place to moderate his video game consumption. And mostly he came up with them. These were his ideas. He said, you know what? I'm going to play no more than 2 hours a day, 3 days a week on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. I said, okay, great. By then he had gotten a job. So he was doing sort of a job while living at home. He was starting to kind of go back to doing some of his computer science work. I said, okay, so we've got a time limit. I said, what else can we think about in terms of barriers? He said, okay, I'm not going to play this one particular game, League of Legends, because that is just like crack to me. I can't moderate that, so I'm not going to play the game. Okay, get that. That's a category, can't do that. He said, I'm only going to play with friends, because when I'm playing with strangers online, I'm really not augmenting my social network, and it just ends up leading to my addiction. So I'm only going to play with friends. I said, that's great. That's another great idea. He did this, and he was able to moderate his use for the whole rest of that academic year. COVID hit, all school was online. He went back to school online, and I said, now we need to talk about this because you're going to be online 24/7 doing school. What can we do? He said, I have an idea. I'm going to have one laptop for games and another laptop for schoolwork, and never the twain shall meet. I said, that's a great idea because we know about cue conditioned kinds of reflexive reactions where we're triggered. So now he has separate laptops, one for gaming and one for school. And on and on and on, he and I together continued to monitor his limits. It wasn't always perfect. He sometimes went outside of the range. We had to do some resets where he took another period of abstinence. Why 4 weeks? Because he really was very addicted and depressed and anxious and suicidal. It doesn't always have to be 4 weeks, but I urge you as a preliminary intervention, whether this is for yourself or your child or a friend, do a dopamine fast. Take a break from your drug of choice. In doing that, you will reset your reward pathways, reset homeostasis. You won't be mentally preoccupied with the drug. You'll be able to take joy and interest in other things. And you'll be better able to use that drug in moderation if you should choose to go back to using that drug in moderation. And here's a really, really important point. When he eventually went back to school and was using video games in moderation and had a reset reward pathway, he took more interest in his studies. All of a sudden, his computer science classes were interesting again. And this is really key because I will get a lot of young people who come in and say, this is boring and that is boring. And the only thing that's interesting to me is TikTok or Facebook or Instagram or video games. What they need to understand is that part of what makes everything else boring is that they have decathected or stopped investing in those other activities. And they're only investing in this online activity, which is changing their reward pathway because it is a drug. In order to make these other so many times folks will say to me, well, that's my passion, or video games are my passion, or I haven't found my passion. And I say to them, here's what makes something passionate for us: investing our time, energy, and creativity in it. We make it passionate. It doesn't become passionate just because. And this is a really important message, I think, for young people today, because everyone's like, I need to find my bliss. If only I could find this thing, or this thing online is my passion. Well, it's about where you're paying attention and where you're investing your energy. The other really important thing to think about on a meta level, especially for digital drugs, is that these algorithms are specifically designed to be addictive. And they use AI to see exactly what drug will be potent for every single individual and to pair those up so that we are, in fact, in large part, not controlling our online use, but rather being controlled by it. The natural history of addiction to these digital drugs is identical, in my experience, to the natural history of addiction to drugs and alcohol. It's no different. People start out using for fun or to solve a problem. Over time, they need more and more to get the same effect. Then they find themselves continuing to use despite consequences and having difficulty stopping, even when they recognize there's a problem and they want to stop. I'm going to go ahead and stop there, open it up for questions. Charlene's going to join us, and I'm looking forward to fielding your questions. I hope that was helpful. And all of the things that I've talked about just now, I do talk about in my new book coming out in August, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lemke. We have comments just flooding in from people about how grateful they are for what you've been talking about. For those of you who didn't maybe hear the beginning, could you just clarify again why, or we've heard in the past that video games can't be addicting. You are very clearly saying, yes, they are. Could you just revisit that for a second so that everybody's up to speed?
Yeah, so, we are natural game players, right? And playing games together is healthy. It helps us learn all kinds of skills, negotiate interpersonal challenges. There are a lot of good things that come from playing games. But what's happened with the technology is that they've essentially drugified many what were previously adaptive and good activities, whether it was gaming or mating or social media, connecting with others. Those are all fundamentally good and healthy things, but they've been drugified by this technology in a number of different ways. What makes something addictive? It is very potent, okay? So video games are incredibly potent. The graphics, the way that people are ranked, we are very responsive in terms of dopamine reward to how we rank compared to others. The desire to complete a task is something that innate that we want to do. We get dopamine when we complete a task. Learning new things, learning new landscapes, those are all things that release dopamine. But the drugified version of this in the form of a video game or social media or pornography turns what is essentially a fundamentally adaptive quality into a drug because of the potency, the ubiquitous and virtually infinite quantity, and the incredible specificity and variety. Again, these AI algorithms are tracking and monitoring what we do online. They know exactly how old we are, what our demographic is, and what our interests are. And then they chase us down. This is not a passive experience in which they're passively watching us, or even that we're in control of. They are suggesting what we should click on, what should come next. The visual is incredibly potent. And just think about just the fundamental problem of infinite quantity. Even if I were addicted to cocaine, after I snort 3 lines, I'm kind of out of cocaine, right? And I'm probably out of money too. Not online. It's absolutely endless. And so I'm constantly at war with my gremlins, right? I'm resetting reward pathways because it's a tsunami of dopamine.
It's kind of mind-boggling. Thank you, really. I mean, parents just really need to hear this. It seems like no matter what the topic is, we always end up talking about video games. We always end up talking about social media. It doesn't matter if it's mental health or substance use or life enjoyment or college admission, those topics keep coming up. So you are really helping us, Anna. All right, here's a question I know a lot of parents are thinking. We know adolescents are impulsive and can't wait to come back to a balanced state. How do we work with them to help them wait to get back to balance and remove the need for that substance? How do you get a teen to wait?
Yeah, so addiction is a spectrum disorder. There are mild, moderate, and severe forms. And how we intervene on this problem really depends on where our child is on that spectrum. For teens who are severely addicted, there may be nothing that we can do or say in our household, or even that they can do, even with the utmost desire to stop using. They may be incapable of it because of the enormous physiologic drive that takes over in the hijacked, addicted brain, which is why I am very grateful for residential treatment facilities. I am very grateful for good wilderness programs. I am very grateful for good therapeutic boarding schools, because they essentially allow kids to be in an environment where they don't have access. And for some individuals to get started on the path to recovery, they need to be in an environment where they don't have access. So I just want to say that, because it really does matter where our kids are on that spectrum. Now, if they're not in that severe category, if they're more like a little bit addicted, like most of the planet at this point, then I think the thing to do is to just have open discussions like we are doing about the fact that these are drugs, what they do to the brain. Talk to them about not just the way they feel when they're using their drug, but how they feel afterward. Talk to them about the gremlins and the come down and how that is driving reuse. Talk to them about how, because of their use, nothing else is interesting. And really shoot down this fallacy that I hear a lot that, well, this is the only thing that's interesting or fun for me. It's like, well, that may be because it's the only thing you're doing. But if you got some distance from it and took a break, you might find a whole vista of other things that you enjoy doing that you haven't done in a long time that you used to do.
So, Dr. Lemke, we keep hearing discussion about, are video games addictive? Is social media addictive? You're clearly coming down on one side of that discussion, it sounds like. Is that right?
So just because I say something is addictive doesn't mean that we should never do it. Alcohol is addictive. Nicotine is addictive. Cannabis is addictive. So all of these things are drugs and they're addictive. Anything that releases dopamine has the potential to be addictive. Frankly, work can be addictive, right? Yeah. So, but what we need to do really is to recognize that a lot of these online activities, including video games, including things like TikTok and Snapchat, are going to be addictive for some individuals. Again, this concept of drug of choice. What is addictive for you, Charlene, may not be addictive for me. The problem is we're now living in a world where there are so many different types of drugs, online or otherwise, that will all eventually kind of find our little thing. So yes, I believe that for some individuals, video games are absolutely addictive. And by the way, they are designed to be so. I'm going to go out on a limb and make a comment that's sexist, but that I think is true. I think they're especially addictive for young men. That somehow that platform with those ratings and that kind of, avatar with the sort of physical, piece of it is especially compelling for today's young men.
Oh, such a good point. So here's a parent who asks, we can't really remove video games as my son is 13 and doing online learning. What can we do? You mentioned that your patient actually had 2 different laptops. What if that is not possible? What can a kid or a parent do?
So this is really hard problem. And I have the same problem. By the way, let me just say, I have a 14-year-old who plays Minecraft, and I'm at work. I can't sit next to him and monitor every second what he's doing. I can look at his grades. I can see how that's going. But frankly, that's not necessarily a test either. You can have kids who are very successful in school who can be using drugs in copious amounts online or otherwise. So this is really tricky. I think the way to handle this, and again, every family is going to be a little bit different, but I suggest having really open and transparent talks about this problem. I suggest acknowledging that we're all to some degree struggling with it. I suggest highlighting truth telling as a fundamental family value that takes precedence over other things. So for example, I will say to my son, you were marked absent today, or your teacher sent me an email. This is true story. Your teacher sent me an email that you weren't doing your work during class. I said, no, I want you to be truthful with me and tell me what were you doing during the class? He said, I was watching YouTube videos. So I applaud him and give him a lot of validation for telling me the truth. And we've worked hard to make him feel that it's safe for him to tell the truth. So this is really important, that we don't immediately retaliate, condemn, or punish or shame for our kids engaging in activities that we are not happy about or that they know are against our family values. We feel upset and anger. I want to shame him. I feel he should feel ashamed, but I work very hard, my husband too, to create a space where it's that he knows the most important thing is to tell the truth. Okay, why is telling the truth so important? Because when we truthfully tell other people what we're doing with our time, we are more likely to become aware of it ourselves. One thing that happens with addiction is people can get into this space of denial where they're not even being truthful with themselves about what they're actually doing. So kind of the first step in owning the problem is telling it truthfully to other people. One of the definitions of addiction I've seen is anything that we do in secret. And I think that's a really good one. So I'll say to my kids, I want to make sure that, and you should too, that anything you do online is something you would be comfortable other people knowing about. Like if you're searching that thing or watching it, would you be comfortable with your mom and dad knowing that you were watching that, or your friends knowing that you were watching that? Think about that. Is it consistent with your goals and values? So these are the types of discussions. Of course, you're going to hear about things like apps that help you track and monitor, things like Moment. And I honestly think for younger children, we must set limits and we must monitor their use and we must put those controls in place. But once the kids get to be to their teenage years, very, very hard to monitor that and to really know what they're doing, in which case we have to instill the values and the discussions so that hopefully somewhere there along the line, they'll think about their choices.
Really good to know. Parents are writing in saying, I know I'm at work. I don't know what my kid is doing at home. It's very, very hard, right? So here's a question. Actually, this is one of my questions. As teen brains develop, and we know now that it takes longer than we used to think, are they better able to handle the lure of screens and video games and social media? I keep hoping that my 16-year-old will get tired of playing games. I have a 30-year-old daughter who took herself off all social media a year and a half ago. Her brother said, no way, she'll be right back. She's not gone back. I asked her and she said she doesn't miss it. So is there hope as their brains get more developed?
There's hope. And I hope that the case that I shared with you is also an example of hope. I mean, this young man didn't have to do any of the things that I suggested. He was eager and willing to do it because he was tired of what his life had become. But he needed some information and tools in order to make that choice. So, but on the other hand, I don't think we as parents can just sort of wishfully hope that they'll figure it out. I think that they need information from us about what it does to the brain, about how it's a drug. They need to know that we're concerned. They need to see their behavior from another perspective. So one thing I'll often say to my older son, I'm always throwing my kids under the bus, and I apologize in advance for that. But my older son, who's 17, who's constantly doing social media on his phone and not doing simple chores like washing his dish, I'll say, I'm going to reflect back to you. Of course, that's like psychobabble, but whatever. That's how I talk. I said, I'm going to reflect back to you that you are always telling me you are so busy with schoolwork and other commitments that you cannot wash the dishes. And yet for the past half hour, you've been swiping on your phone. I said, that's upsetting to me. That's upsetting to me. And I don't think that you're aware of the amount of time. So it's a fine line, because we don't want to be constantly nagging, but we want to raise their awareness and attention. And this generation, I mean, we're all trying to figure this out, but especially millennials and Gen Z, they're the guinea pigs. I mean, they're going to have to figure this out. And I think they are beginning to realize that there is a huge dark downside, but we can help them. We can't just say, oh, they'll figure it out. We have to actively engage around this problem.
I mean, I think The Social Dilemma, in some ways, at least for me, Dr. Lemke, was hard to watch. I didn't enjoy all parts of that film, but I think it was good for parents to see that teens don't like being manipulated. And if you can let them know, as you've been talking about, how AI is controlling them, that can help break it. Do you think that will help?
Yeah, there was a really famous look at public health campaigns to get teens to stop smoking cigarettes.
Yeah.
And the initial campaign was just all about how dangerous the cigarettes are and how they'll kill you. It didn't work at all. But when they did a public health campaign that told teenagers that, wow, like those corporate CEO types, they're getting rich off you and they're controlling you, that had an impact. So yes, teens are natural rebels. They naturally want to do the opposite of whatever their parents are telling them to do. So I do think that on some level, letting them know that they may feel like they're controlling their use online when in fact it's controlling them. And again, one of the best ways to figure out that that's true is to take a break, to do a dopamine fast, if not for a month, for a day. I mean, even a day is hard for people. Put it away for one day. Notice your mental preoccupation with it for the first 12 hours, and then notice that fade away and dissipate in the latter 12 hours. Another thing I recommend is if you're able as a family to have a dopamine fast for a day, or take a tech-free vacation where you go somewhere and do something together as a family where nobody has a device. I mean, people feel naked now without their devices, but it's possible. You can do this. And together as a family, observe what's happening in terms of the quality and quantity of the time you're spending together.
Boy, the questions keep pouring in. Let's see what we can do. This is a great question. Can you reiterate what you meant by a passion and what constitutes a passion? I'm sure my son would say that my taking away screens would mean I'm basically taking away his livelihood. So if you could, again, just revisit that passion comment.
Yeah. So this is a really important point, especially, during these COVID times when we're all on our screens. But a lot of kids will say, well, that's the most fun thing I do, or the only fun thing I do. It's my passion. It's the one thing I love. How could you take it away? And I think what they need to understand is that is the deceptive nature of any addictive drug, that it is so reinforcing that we don't actually see. We are blind to, number one, the way that it actually makes us depressed, anxious, bored, irritable, lonely when we're not doing it. But it also means that we don't have the energy, creativity to invest in other activities which actually have the potential over the long term to be more interesting and more rewarding, because we're fixated in a narrow tunnel on this immediate reward of this online activity. That is the nature of addictive drugs, right? They create a world unto themselves where we actually can no longer see cause and effect because we're so caught up in the immediate reward, which is why I think it's important. This young man that I described, he was like thinking about changing his major. He said, I thought I wanted to be a computer science major, but my classes are really boring. They're not interesting. Then he did a dopamine fast and took a break. He went back to classes. He's like, I don't really understand why all my classes this semester are so much more interesting. It's like, well, because you have, a pleasure pain balance that's been reset, right? You don't need constant dopamine for things to be interesting. You've made yourself more accessible to pleasure, curiosity, natural rewards because you're not bombarding yourself with dopamine. It is very subtle and very tricky, but it's why this time away is fundamental. And for younger kids, you can explain this stuff, but I really have to say for younger children, we just must, they don't have to like it. We can say, as your parent, I don't consider this amount of time spent doing this activity healthy. You can disagree with me, but I am the boss and you cannot like it, but that's why we're doing it. And you can explain it and all that, but at the end of the day, I really think good parenting here is not about being their best friend and, encouraging their life passion and being happy all the time. It's like, yeah, life is hard. There are things we have to do that we don't want to do.
So true. So hard. Sounds simple, isn't.
No, that's right.
Here's a question that I know that if you could answer this one, Dr. Lemke, we'd all have $1 million. How much time is okay for video games each day for kids to avoid being addicted?
I don't know. There's no data on it. I can tell you that daily use is concerning because daily use doesn't give enough time in between to reset the reward pathway. I think that time limits in negotiation with your child make sense with at least 1 day per week of not using. Again, this is for younger children that we still have control over. We're all acknowledging by the time they get to high school and they get their own phones, they're off and running. There's almost nothing we can do unless they're so severely addicted and dysfunctional that they need to get professional treatment. So again, that's that whole spectrum thing. But the older child, all we can do is just reflect back to them, try to educate them, express our concerns. The younger child, we really do want to set limits. And I personally think that just like we wouldn't have chocolate cake for breakfast, we would have it after dinner on some nights after we've had our vegetables. That is how we approach the screen time with our younger children in our family too. Have you done all your chores? Have you done all your homework? Okay, how much time are you going to play? Shall we say 45 minutes, an hour? That seems like a reasonable amount of time. 45 minutes, an hour, you're still on. Get off, get off, get off. I'm doing the same thing you are. Get off, get off, get off. Okay, hour and a half. Okay, that's not great. We agreed on 45 minutes or an hour, but an hour and a half, okay, that's unreasonable. But next time, can we agree on a time and can you stick to it? So what I'm reflecting back to you is I'm also struggling as a parent with the very same things, but we can't give up the good fight because it's a fight worth fighting. And I think our kids fundamentally can understand this, that, you don't have chocolate cake first thing in the morning. You don't even have it for dinner. You have it after you've had your vegetables. So teeing it up like that, I think is really useful. Not letting them do it every day, making sure they're doing other things, right? Getting their dopamine from other places, from exercise, from being with friends in real life, from learning something that's hard to learn or from doing something for somebody else.
Thank you. Wonderful advice. And, parents, there is hope. It does get better. My kids are older. They've learned that when they would go to parties, they would all put their phones in a bowl. As I said, my daughter took herself off social media 1.5 years ago. She works for IDEO, very creative, very connected. They can get off of it, but I think they have to choose. They have to realize that it's controlling their lives rather than them being able to control their lives. All right, this is a very important question. How does this work with stimulants, and is it different for people with ADHD who may already have issues with dopamine processing?
So this is a very controversial issue. I do not have the answer to this question, but I can tell you that a lot of the young adults and older adults that I see who are addicted to stimulants, meaning that they're misusing prescription stimulants, did get started on stimulants as a child or a teenager for ADD or ADHD. So there was previously this thinking, which is not based on evidence and may not be true, that giving a stimulant to a child, as long as they have ADHD, will somehow insulate or protect them from addiction, and it's not true. Just like giving opioids to a person with chronic pain doesn't make them immune to opioid addiction. We're really bad at predicting who will and will not get addicted. Anybody can. Strattera, Adderall, Ritalin, they all release enormous amounts of dopamine in the reward pathway, and there are serious risks. And I'm just going to leave it at that, because other than that, it's very controversial. I have known and know of many young people who find stimulants incredibly helpful and for whom these medications have been life-saving. I'm not advocating that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I don't think we are sufficiently concerned about the risks.
Okay, here's a related question. Can you address addiction to drugs given for mental health conditions, especially with regards to teens?
Yeah, so I mean, it's my belief that we're overprescribing the psychotropics across the board, that we should prescribe less and intervene and behaviorally more. Again, I would just emphasize that there's a time and a place for psychotropic medications, but I think that in general, we prescribe far too often at far too high doses and for far too long. I like to see, especially for more mild to moderate forms of psychiatric symptoms, that these medications can be a helpful buffer or bridge for a short period of time until people can learn the tools, the behavioral tools and the psychological tools to help them. But ideally, we wouldn't keep folks on these medicines for a long, long time. Having said that, I do have patients who are on these medicines for long periods of time doing really well. So again, it's finding that middle path, not one extreme or another, but there isn't enough awareness of the addictive potential of things like, Xanax or Norco or Ritalin or whatever it is.
All right, this is a question that really interesting. Again, sort of on this substance abuse control. Parent asks, what do you think about a parent controlling a young adult's usage of a drug, i.e. medical marijuana? My 18-year-old has a medical marijuana card to address anxiety. He's not using it medicinally. We're not sure what our role should be.
Yeah, so, this is a hard one.
Very hard question.
I have encountered families where they were actually counseled by a psychologist to buy cannabis for their child as a way to limit the harm that was related to his cannabis use because he was engaging in petty theft in order to get money to buy cannabis. I thought it was a disastrous idea at the time, and indeed it entirely backfired. And I really discourage parents getting in the business of somehow providing or meting out addictive substances. Once your child is an adult, of course, they are going to do what they're going to do, but that doesn't mean that you have to abandon your goals or values. Furthermore, if you are housing that child, you actually have quite a bit of control and power in terms of what we call contingency management strategies. So you can say to your adult cannabis using child, we don't think this is good for you. We don't approve of it. We would like you to go and get some treatment for it. And if you're not willing to do that, then we probably need to discuss a different kind of living arrangement. So part of what, and this sounds really harsh, but I'm just going to say part of what gets people into recovery from addiction is real life consequences from their addiction. Part of what keeps people in their addiction is enabling that behavior by protecting them from those real life consequences. So when we make it easy for our child to use and we make that drug readily available and we pay for it and we even go out and get it for them, we are essentially enabling their addiction if we conceptualize it as an addiction. In order to get them into recovery, there often have to be real life consequences for that individual, like they have to go out and get a job in order to maybe pay their rent, which they may discover isn't really all that compatible with smoking pot as much as they're doing it.
Yeah, okay. Lot to think about. A lot to think about. This parent, again, this is related to remote learning, which we're all in the midst of this big experiment. How addictive is just being on a screen, not necessarily playing video games? So many preschoolers to adults are now online throughout the day. I mean, it just makes me wonder, Dr. Lemke, do we have a whole addicted society? You might argue yes.
Yeah, so the reason my book is called Dopamine Nation is because I do believe that we have all become vulnerable to this problem of addiction. And therefore, we really need to look to a different model or framework for living, because it's really an unprecedented time. I also have come to believe that screens in and of themselves, no matter what is on them, are riveting for our attention. And it's interesting because with COVID rules kind of loosening, what we've tried here just in my own professional life is some hybrid approaches where we meet some of us in real life and then part of us zooming in. I would have predicted prior to doing it that the people who were there in real life would be more engaged with each other, ignoring the screen. In fact, the exact opposite has happened. We're all riveted to the screen. There is something about the quality of this interface. I don't know if it's the images or the way in which it's almost like a live organism, like a baby that needs constant attention. When I speak now, I eliminate my image. So I'm not seeing myself right now. I'm seeing you all. Why do I do that? Because I noticed that my brain is automatically trained to look at the mouth that's moving, right? Which makes sense, right? That we would want to look at the person who's talking. But I don't want to look at myself when I'm talking. That's incredibly distracting for me and alarming in multiple ways. So I have learned to turn that off so I actually cannot see myself. You might try that too, little tricks here and there, but I think we are riveted by this technology. And I think it's, it's a challenge.
I am going to try that. I read an article about it recently. They said, in our normal life, people weren't running after us with a mirror. And yet that's what we're doing all day long now, right?
Well, so, even more insidious than that, these online behaviors do really promote, especially in young people, a very narcissistic preoccupation. And that is really scary because we already live in a kind of sort of narcissistic-ogenic society where we're encouraged to pursue our individual, accomplishments at the expense of the group. But now this interface has made it even worse because people are like obsessively looking at themselves, and it's just not good.
Here's one, Anna. Hello from Ireland. I totally agree with Dr. Lemke. I have a 9-year-old daughter whose mood really was deteriorating, angry, etc. We decided before bed, no screens, we play cards or board games and come together, but parents really have to lead that activity, just like you mentioned. So we have just another couple minutes together. What final thought would you like to leave parents with today, Anna?
I want to let you know that even though I write about this and I've thought a lot about it, and I even have a book coming out about it, it's not like I've figured it out. And I struggle myself, going down the YouTube rabbit hole. Sometimes in our house, everybody's in a different room on a different screen. And I just think to myself, what is happening to our family? But so I don't want to put myself as above or separate. I'm trying to figure this out too. I, however, am really optimistic that we will figure this out. That by having these discussions, by thinking about it, by applying our big brains to this problem, We are going to solve this problem. It's going to take a long time, but we're going to get there. And so don't give up on yourself or give up on your kid or your family or the world. Let's just keep talking about it. Well, my patients are my inspiration. Their creativity and ingenuity in figuring out how to live in this world has inspired me to live better. And so that's what I would end with.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lemke. I always like to end by saying what gives you hope, and you've just given us hope. So let's all use our big brains and figure this out. As she suggests, nothing works better than communication. So talk to your kids, talk to them about the problem, talk to them about the solutions, get them involved in setting those limits if they're old enough to be part of that discussion. Again, sorry we had to leave some questions in the Q&A box, but it has been a wonderful conversation. So a huge virtual thank you to you, Dr. Anna Lemke, for everything you've done for us today and for the community. Take care, everybody. Stay safe and stay well. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.